Hey everybody. Make sure I'm recording. I freak out that I don't record. I forgot to press record. Okay, I am recording. Let's party. Okay, so what we're reading today is chapter 5 of Friedrich Pollock's the Éminence... not Friedrich, Jesus Christ. This is a terrible recording already. I'm reading Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Chapter 5 is titled The Quest. For Pollock, breaking with the communist movement marked a more significant caesura than it did for Horkheimer, who was already an established academic and heading for a chair. Pollock, too, had recently completed his postdoctoral qualification, but ultimately was still unclear what he wanted to spend his life doing. While Gutenberg's incapacitation suggested certain options, Germany's palpable shift to the right made it increasingly unlikely that Pollock would be able to secure a chair. Focusing on Marxian theory and socialist economic models, Pollock had marginalized himself academically, and his connections to the Soviet Union made Pollock suspicious in the eyes of the authorities. Quote, in the police files marked, quote, confidential or, quote, secret, end quote, they were created in connection with the investigations of the political police as to whether the institute had been infiltrated by communists. Quote, one name in particular, end quote, featured most prominently among those suspected by the authorities, and this from the very beginning, that of Friedrich Pollock. When it came to Gutenberg's succession, Pollock was therefore automatically out of the running, and it fell to Horkheimer to secure the position. That said, both then and later, Pollock readily admitted to himself and others that Horkheimer was in any case the more gifted intellectual and therefore better suited to the position. Pollock was unsure what to do. Surely, should he really give absolute precedence to Horkheimer's academic career? Was the academy actually the right place for Pollock? Or should he return to the private sector as his father, who, given his age, had since retired from the family business, had hoped all along? The business was now run by Hans Pollock, who would doubtless have welcomed his brother back. Or was this just his father's voice belatedly asserting itself after a prolonged phase of adolescent rebellion? Perhaps his mourning the untimely death early in 1930 of his mother, with whom he had enjoyed a good relationship, made Pollock yearn for a closer relationship to his family. Yet Pollock dismissed these considerations. The, quote, religion, end quote, of his covenant with Horkheimer was real. Pollock remained committed to the underlying norms of loyalty, solidarity, and truthfulness. But what might this mean in practice? It was still unclear then what Pollock ultimately wanted to do with the freedom Pollock had gained by turning his back on his birth family and the bourgeois concepts of marriage and family life. After the war, Pollock had flirted with the idea of going into politics, but in the meantime, Pollock had dismissed this option, to which he would doubtless have been well suited. What alternatives were there that were both viable and justifiable in terms of the standards enshrined in the friendship contract? Pollock's drawn-out quest for a clear purpose finally came to an end in 1930, when Horkheimer became Gutenberg's successor, inaugurating an entirely new phase in Pollock's life. Prima facie, his role in the Institute barely changed as a result. As Gutenberg's assistant and secretary of the Society of Social Research, Pollock was responsible for the Institute's administration and finances. As acting director during the interregnum that lasted from Gutenberg's stroke in 1928 to Horkheimer's appointment in 1930, his role had largely stayed the same. Now, as deputy director, Pollock was again the administrative head of the Institute. In this capacity, Pollock was responsible for crucial decisions, for example, when it came to the establishment of the Institute's branch in Geneva, or the prescient transfer of the Foundation's capital abroad that he arranged in coordination with Felix Weil. The Institute's profile was entirely Horkheimer's responsibility, however. To be sure, the two friends worked hand in glove, and Pollock was consulted on all new appointments. Even so, Pollock had made a conscious decision henceforth to play the second fiddle to Horkheimer. It was now up to him to secure the material and organizational conditions required to maintain a protected interior sphere within which they might be able to lead the good life to which their covenant aspired. The Institute henceforth mediated between interior and exterior, between the world of their covenant and the outside world. In a sense, the Institute on Victoria Alley marked the boundary between Kronberg and the world. Now that the two friends were in charge, they could ensure that the values of the interior also prevailed, at least to some extent, at the Institute. On the other hand, they appreciated the Marxist critique of life reform and other utopian movements and understood that their île heureuse was just that, a resplendent island of peace in the stormy capitalist ocean governed by altogether different norms. As Horkheimer observed in the aphorisms he wrote between 1926 and 1931, and published in 1934 under a pseudonym, Heinrich Regius, as Dämmerung, dawn, it was an ideological delusion to assume that one's own norms were entirely unaffected by those of society. It would take a, quote, radical transformation of the individual's social circumstances, end quote, for it to, quote, grasp how many socially determined elements still inherent even in the love, friendship, respect, and solidarity it encountered, end quote. In short, their île heureuse was located in a hostile ocean that constantly flooded its beaches and covered them with its mud. Yet for this very reason, the two friends eschewed the option of escapist withdrawal and boldly defended the commitments of their covenant against the outside world. To this end, they maintained Grünberg's dictatorial style of leadership. If disagreements occurred, the final decision always lay with the director, i.e. with Horkheimer, in consultation with Pollock. All important decisions, including those on the future profile of the Institute and its stance on Marxism, were made jointly by Horkheimer and Pollock. In keeping with the commitments of their covenant, it was crucial that the political distance they developed in their dealings with Orthodox Marxism not amount to some form of betrayal. As they saw it was they who were the true guardians of the Marxian legacy, which they were defending against its doctrinaire cannibalization by the Communist International. On the one hand, in the communist movement, quote, barring an urgent reversal, loyalty to the tenet of materialism is in danger of turning into a mindless and contentless cult of literalism and personality, end quote, Horkheimer wrote in one of his aphorisms. On the other hand, quote, the materialist content, i.e. the knowledge of the real world, is the preserve of those who have become disloyal to Marxism, end quote, i.e. reformist social democracy. This juxtaposition offered a framework allowing the Institute to continue its engagement of Marxism and indeed to present critical theory as an undogmatic continuation of Marxist theory while keeping their distance from both Bolshevism in its increasingly totalitarian guise and from reform-oriented social democracy. Few individuals were quite as assured as Pollock and Horkheimer's contempt as turncoats. To be sure, they acknowledged that tactical conduct could be beneficial on occasion, nor did one always have to reveal the whole truth. To act in contravention to one's own convictions and switch allegiances depending on the circumstances, however, was something they considered morally reprehensible. As young adults, they had struggled with their fathers who met their contempt for the bourgeois lifestyle and its attendant norms with utter incomprehension. Analogously, they expected everyone else to unfetter themselves from obsolete authorities and be accountable only to their own reason. That said, Pollock too looked to certain role models, and his attempts to emulate them occasionally took on a bizarre quality, especially in its more formal aspects. His constantly palpable commitment to his special bond with Horkheimer sometimes struck a comical note with observers, not that any of them knew of the friendship contract, or Pollock's setting himself in scene as the covenant's, quote, ministère d'extérieur, end quote, which in part at least was ironic in nature. Close friends and colleagues certainly did notice, however, that Horkheimer and Pollock sometimes behaved like an old married couple. In his memoirs, the philosopher Ludwig Marcuse, who ran the feature section of the Frankfurter General Anzeiger from 1925 to 1929, wrote that he encountered Horkheimer as a, quote, charming man, overflowing with warmth, end quote, who had his, quote, restrained, seemingly much sterner friend, Friedrich Pollock, end quote, in tow wherever he went. They were inseparable and existed only as a package, end quote. In 1930, Pollock and Horkheimer put Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno up in Kronberg, where, as he later recalled, they led a, quote, secluded life characterized by a palpable dislike for furnished rooms, end quote, for several weeks, so he could work on his Kierkegaard book in peace. Adorno was fascinated by their lifestyle and enjoyed the time he was able to spend with them, yet, in a letter he wrote to Krakauer on the 12th of May 1930, Adorno also made fun of Pollock and Horkheimer, referring to them as the, quote, chums Lenin and Trotsky, end quote. This was quite an epithet, but whom was Adorno identifying as Lenin and whom as Trotsky? Did he see Horkheimer, who was about to take control of the Institute, in the role of Lenin, and Pollock, who in his capacity as, quote, People's Commissar of Foreign Affairs, War, Nutrition, Transport, and Publishing, end quote, took charge of the Institute's administration and the everyday concerns of the interior, as doing Trotsky's job? Maybe. The similarities between the style of leadership in Lenin's, quote, Party of a New Type, end quote, and the Institute are certainly striking. Yet Pollock himself might well have been more inclined to think of two other chums, Marx and Engels. In their case, the congenial division of labor was even more clearly established than it was between Lenin and Trotsky. As we saw, it took Pollock some time to decide which of their respective roles he wanted to adopt, that of the prominent critic of society engaged mainly in theoretical study, or that of the loyal companion of the great thinker who devoted his life to the cause but stood back as the intellectual in his own right. These roles, in the strict distinction between the public sphere and the study, were, of course, foreshadowed in their friendship contract from the outset. His preparatory work for a biography of Marx demonstrates that in the course of his decision-making process, Pollock also contemplated choosing him as his role model. In 1920, he worked on a detailed reconstruction of Marx's life path and familial relations. It seems noteworthy that Marx's Jewish background featured prominently in this context. Marx's grandfather, Marx Levy, he noted, was a rabbi in Trier, as was Marx's uncle, Samuel Marx, another son of Marx Levy and Eva Marx, née Moses, and Samuel's son, Karl Marx's cousin, Moses Marx, was, whatever he may eventually have done, at one point a rabbinical trainee in Gleiwitz. Pollock noted that the birth name of Karl Marx's father, Heinrich Marx, was Herschel, and that he had converted only in 1829. To this note, he had an asterisk and adopted Heinrich Heine's well-known formulation, wrote in the margin, quote, entrance ticket to European culture, end quote, presumably to indicate that Heinrich Marx had not converted from religious conviction. He also noted that the rabbinic ancestry of Karl's mother, Henriette, née Pressburg, stretched back for centuries. What is the case is that Marx's father, Heinrich Marx, had to convert to Protestantism in order to practice law. Having established the coordinates of Marx's life path, Pollock proceeded to write short summaries of Marx's works. Here not only capital, but, quote, on the Jewish question, end quote. Two featured prominently. His discussion of this text was prefaced by the following note, quote, Moses Mendelssohn tolerated by Friedrich I as bookkeeper to one of the privileged money Jews, end quote. Pollock's succinct excerpt then reads as follows, quote, political and human emancipation. Bourgeois society is of a completely Jewish character, therefore the Jew can claim political emancipation. Human emancipation only possible in new society, end quote. Taking on board the contention that Mendelssohn was tolerated only because he enjoyed the protection of the king, who wanted his realm to benefit with the wealth of Bernhard Isaac, who in turn employed Mendelssohn as the bookkeeper of his silk factory, Pollock assumed that the emancipation granted to the Jews of Imperial Germany when it was established in 1871 merely amounted to a continuation of the old system. It was owed not to rational or moral insight but to the emergence of capitalism. The early modern, quote, money Jews, end quote, were proto-capitalist and precursors of a new social order. Since the consolidation of capitalism had turned the Christians into quote, money Jews, end quote, i.e. into merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs, there was no longer any reason to treat Jews any differently from Christians. As the prosperity and respectability of Pollock's family illustrated, the Jews' political emancipation was well underway. Human emancipation, by contrast, was yet to come from Jews and Christians alike, who now jointly offered the yoke of the capitalist order. Jointly suffered the yoke of the capitalist order. Human emancipation where am I at? Human emancipation was about far more than legal equality. It promised material and intellectual contentment to all, and this promise had yet to be fulfilled. Yet it was not only the content of Marx's thought that appealed to Pollock, so too did his character. As is well known, Marx devoted all his energy and all the funds he inherited to the communist cause, but he did not eschew life's pleasures. The son of an industrialist, Engels was not only able to live comfortably off his family's fortune, Engels was also unwavering in his support of Marx, who spent much of his life alternating between modest comfort and regular visits to the pawnbroker. Occasional donations from various sections of the communist movement aside, it was Engels above all who made it possible for Marx to keep up, at least the appearance, for the most part, of maintaining a bourgeois lifestyle. Marx's travel, far from leisure purposes, and to spend time in prestigious spa resorts such as Carlsbad, Karlovy Vary, likewise belies that some might associate with the cliché of a sullen and embittered revolutionary. Marx was no bon vivant, and, for the most part, tended to be, quote, patriarchal, prudish, bourgeois, industrious, independent, or trying to be, cultured, respectable, German with a distinct patina of Jewish background, end quote. But he knew full well why he wanted the proletariat to share in society's wealth. In this respect, Marx was motivated not by abstract principles, but by the fact that the overwhelming majority of the population was being cheated out of a contented and fulfilled life. Pollock no more inclined towards asceticism than Marx. This had not changed since his time in Brussels, when he and Horkheimer spent their nights out on the town, before turning their attentions to the dire state of the world again in the morning. For Pollock, distress at the world's desolate state did not preclude pleasure where it was attainable. Now he occasionally attended Hanna and Paul Tillich's roaring parties characterized, if Friedrich Wilhelm Graf is to be believed, quote, not only by freely flowing alcohol, and sometimes other drugs too, but by partner swapping and excessive erotic abandon, end quote. Pollock himself was hardly given to excess, however. Indeed, the former Institute employee, Gerhard Mayer, on Martin Jay's account, remembered him as being, quote, steady, even obsessive, end quote. The moderation typical of the German Jewish bourgeoisie was very much Pollock's preferred modus. He did not share his father's aversion to luxury and excess, but neither was he comfortable with the public transgression of sexual norms, even when it took place in the house of a close friend and was merely semi-public. He consistently struck strangers as being not exactly uptight, but certainly restrained. Generally known as an earnest, helpful, and friendly man, Pollock's determination could make him seem aloof and pernickety. Overall, not even entirely by coincidence perhaps, he seems to have resembled Marx rather more than Engels, the bon vivant. Marx's theory, after all, sprang not from an abstract juggling with concepts, but from careful reflection on personal experiences. One of these experiences was absolutely central to Pollock's thought too. What drove human beings to political activism was not poverty or desperation, but the contradiction between that which is and that which would be possible. It followed that the world needed to be judged not on the basis of abstract ideals, but in terms of what, taking into account the current circumstances, it had to offer humankind. Theory's task was to work out how to close the gap between the actual and the potentially possible state of play. Like Pollock, Marx had witnessed the failure of a revolution at close quarters. Yet, unlike many other former revolutionaries, he did not turn to reactionary politics. Instead, he took a fresh look at the theory that had just been disproven by reality. The result of this process of reflection was Marx's Capital. Published in 1867, Marx's Capital gave socialism a new direction, one that hinged on the critique of ideology. As we saw, Pollock's doctoral thesis focused on capital, and it was a work he studied time and again for many years. Unlike, say, Herbert Marcuse, who foregrounded the materialist anthropology and humanistic theory of alienation of the early Marx, Pollock always stuck with the, quote, mature, end quote, Marx. Perhaps it was up to Pollock to write a new capital for the 20th century. Or should he rather let Horkheimer don the mantle of the new Marx and serve as his guardian angel? As we saw, he eventually chose the second option, arguably underestimating its significance. He henceforth assumed his own scholarly work to be auxiliary in nature, designed merely to feed into Horkheimer's scholarship proper. Yet, as we will see, this in no way detracted from his continued ambition to develop a cutting-edge form of Marxist theory. Needless to say, neither was Horkheimer Marx nor Pollock Engels. Needless to say, neither was Horkheimer Marx nor Pollock Engels. Even so, their unusual productive friendship offered an extremely inspiring model. In the end, Pollock's Marx biography did not come to fruition, but in 1926, he was able to draw on the material he had gathered on this end to articulate his long-standing sympathy with both the theoretician and the human being Karl Marx by tearing into Zombart's revised (10th) edition of his monumental two-volume Der proletarische Sozialismus (quote, Marxismus), end quote, end parenthesis, proletarian socialism, quote, Marxism, end quote, end parenthesis. Zombart's Widerlegung, end quote, des Marxismus, parenthesis, Zombart's, quote, refutation, end quote, of Marxism, end parenthesis, published as a supplementary volume to Grünberg's Archiv, was Pollock's first standalone publication. Quote, at age 30, end quote, he wrote, Marx had, quote, established his philosophical and sociological concepts with such clarity that he did not need to correct himself in any substantial respect for the remainder of his life. Few knew the meaning of lifelong loyalty as well as he did, end quote. When he wrote these lines, Pollock himself was 32, and it is surely no stretch to suggest that he identified with the strength of character on Marx's part that he praised so effusively. Overall, his treatment of Marx in this slim volume was strongly hagiographical in nature. Marx and Engels, he wrote, quote, enjoyed an absolutely perfect 38-year friendship of the most intimate kind. He joined the Communist League in 1847, and from then on, undeterred by all the unpleasantness, undeterred by the, quote, most awful destitution, end quote, in which he was forced to live for many years, fought tirelessly for the proletariat until death took him, end quote. The prominent sociologist Werner Sombart, once a social democrat, now a conservative nationalist and proponent of the corporatist state, was an extremely influential scholar and public intellectual. He held the prestigious chair in political economy at the Friedrich Wilhelm University in Berlin and enjoyed considerable acclaim, even among some leftists, as an economic historian of capitalism. Surprisingly well disposed toward Marx in the first instance, his anti-Semitism increasingly got the better of him, and he began to rant about the rootless and truculent, quote, negator, end quote, Marx, not unlike Richard Wagner, who in Das Judentum in der Musik castigated the Jews for supposedly being incapable of true creativity. Sombart claimed that Marx had lacked the, quote, capacity to generate productive and feasible ideas, end quote. Nor was Marx Zombart's sole target. Sombart also had plenty of vitriol to spare for Rosa Luxemburg, whom Sombart characterized as, quote, bloodthirsty and venomous, end quote. As Sombart explained at length, radical Marxists were radical because they were envious of those who managed to find a place, or at least accepted their station in life. The worse an individual's resentment of those they envied, the more, quote, bloodthirsty, end quote, the more, quote, bloodthirsty and venomous, end quote, they became. What chance, then, was there for Rosa Luxemburg, who, as Sombart would have it, was addled by, quote, 4 forms of invidiousness, as a woman, as a foreigner, as a Jew, and as a cripple, end quote. Sombart. Ultimately, Sombart's approach stood for an assault on reason itself, as was evidenced not least by his anti-Semitism. After all, for Werner Sombart, the Jews are responsible not only for capitalism, but also for capitalism's opposite. In the family tree he constructed to establish the genealogy of, quote, proletarian socialism, end quote, the, quote, Jewish spirit, end quote, was one of the two original ancestors. This inherent contradiction, which was typical of a great deal of anti-Semitic ideology at the time, demonstrated to Pollock that Sombart was driven not by critical inquisitiveness, but by an irrational hatred that could be met only with polemical means. Sombart became something of a permanent adversary for Pollock. If it is true that each of the critical theoreticians had their own personal, quote, dark, end quote, author who never ceased to challenge or provoke them, we might think of Heidegger in Adorno's case, of Schopenhauer or Nietzsche in Horkheimer's case, and in doubt Neumann's case of Carl Schmitt. Then Pollock's, quote, dark, end quote, antagonist was doubtless Sombart. Having begun to read Sombart as a student, by the end of his life, he was hardly less familiar with Sombart's work than he was with his own. Having begun to read Sombart in one of his final interviews, he acknowledged that Sombart was the actual author of the term late capitalism, a concept that both critical theory and the student protest movement had appropriated. Yet whatever the merits of some of Sombart's studies in economic history may have been, Sombart's radical anti-Jewish hostility was integral to his anti-capitalism, and Pollock felt compelled to take him to task, not only in order to defend Marx, but also in his capacity as the son of a Jewish entrepreneur. It was in 1911, in his book Die Juden und das Wirtschaftsleben, the Jews and modern capitalism, that Sombart first acclaimed that Jews were responsible for the corrosive impact of capitalism. In the German edition, one need only take a look at the detailed table of contents to appreciate Sombart's characterization of the, quote, Jews, end quote. But this is not reflected in Mordecai Epstein's partially sanitized rendering. Where am I at? Sorry. Even so, the same stereotypes still pervade the text, but one might conclude from the translation that they are cultural rather than racial characteristics. Quote, the intellectuality of the Jew is strong, end quote. Sombart lamented, quote, that it tends to develop at the expense of other mental qualities, end quote. Quote, fond of abstraction, end quote, Sombart posited, quote, the Jew lacks the quality of instinctive understanding, end quote. Hence the Jews, quote, behold the world not with their, quote, soul, end quote, but with their intellect, end quote. And, quote, the Jew never loses himself in the outer world, end quote. He, quote, will walk through the world without seeing, end quote. Moreover, he lacks, quote, the true conception of the personal side of life, end quote. Quote, rationalism is the characteristic trait of Judaism as of capitalism, end quote. And the Jews have consistently been, quote, rationalists, both in theory and in practice, end quote. In short, quote, the Jew, end quote, is, quote, the born representative of a, quote, liberal, end quote, view of life, end quote. Sombart claimed that the book was a work of serious scholarship, yet the thin veneer of, quote, facts, end quote, and statistics barely conceal that it was in fact an anti-Semitic polemic. In his preface to the German edition, which was omitted from the English translation, he unambiguously set the Jews apart from the rest of humanity and identified the Jews as the originators, agents, and beneficiaries of the capitalist economic order and the liberal culture it engendered. From the vantage of conservatives and reactionaries, communists and social democrats alike, it was hard to imagine a worse indictment. Pollock did not draw the numerical overrepresentation of Jews in trade and industry into question, but he decried the suggestion that this reflected racial characteristics or the essence of Judaism as it was, outlandish nonsense. Actually, the reason was historical. In the medieval period, Jews had been excluded from agricultural and most artisanal professions. It was this historical coincidence that really had turned the Jews into the trailblazers of capitalism. In this respect, Marx's analysis, quote, Marx's analysis in the piece on the Jewish question had been spot on. The critique of domination and exploitation needed to abstract from the individuals who happened to play certain economic roles and focus instead on the underlying social relations and their significance for the capitalist mode of production in the capitalist mode of production's entirety. Pollock drew out this line of thought further in the notes he made for his first own seminar in the summer semester of 1928 on, quote, problems of historical materialism, end quote. It focused especially on the formation of ideology in the capitalist order. Apart from Pollock's assistant, Heinz Langerhans and Rudolf Zelka, the latter had translated numerous Russian sources for Pollock while he was working on his postdoctoral thesis. The seminar participants included Irma Goitein, whose doctoral thesis on Moses Hess and his impact on Marx was published as a supplementary volume in Grünberg's Archiv in 1931, and Nelly Helt, and her husband, Ernst Helt, Rosenbaum, Horkheimer and Wittfogel attended from time to time. In her seminar paper, Julia Feinberg, a student who was 20 at the time, claimed that the categories, quote, denomination, race, ancestry, and education, end quote, had the capacity to modify economic relations, for example, when it came to, quote, trust in capitalism, end quote. This was a sensitive issue insofar as it could be understood as a reference to the anti-Semitic canard of the Jewish world conspiracy and the claim that all Jews recognized and were in cahoots with each other. Not that this was what Feinberg meant, but it did seem to her that individuals' social, ethnic, and religious background were sociological factors that shaped loyalties and relations of trust. One might interpret this as a watered-down version of Zombart's thesis. Pollock objected that none of these categories were genuinely fixed. Even categories such as, quote, race, climate, etc., end quote, were subject to man-made change, he noted. Quote, man's nature, race, and nature as it concerns him, end quote, might influence his, quote, proficiency, end quote, but nature was changeable. Quote, the temperament and disposition of peoples adjust, end quote. One might understand this objection not least in terms of Pollock's own Jewish assimilationism. Pollock's father had impressed on him at an early age that the Jews had ceased to be a nation and were now merely a religious denomination to which one might choose to belong or not. For Pollock, Jewishness was an exclusively religious category. If the intense interest he had shown in Marx's ancestry and familiar relations not so long ago spoke to some kind of more deep-seated attachment to Jewish culture and tradition, he was no more aware of it than it gave him cause for thought that virtually all his friends were Jewish. Needless to say, this is not a matter of biology or the climate, but resulted from the fact that German Jewry in the Weimar era was about so much more than religion. One may attribute to the similar One might attribute it to the similar socialization experienced by the young Jewish intellectuals who mainly came from bourgeois families, or to the continued impact of a latent cultural tradition, and the ostracization they still encountered as Jews in some arenas doubtless played an important role too. The fact of the matter is that many German Jewish intellectuals shared a profound mutual affinity and sense of solidarity. They might position themselves as opposite ends of the political spectrum and regularly engage in harsh controversies and polemics that pitted them against each other, and yet the majority of Jewish intellectuals, just like Pollock, belonged to networks that were almost exclusively Jewish. Experiences of anti-Semitism, however subtle, routinely reinforced their conviction that these networks needed to be maintained. Towards the end of his life, Pollock claimed not to have encountered much anti-Semitism prior to the rise of the National Socialists, but he certainly knew about that outright polemic was the only suitable response to what was to adopt Zombart's terminology, a, quote, bloodthirsty and venomous, end quote, pamphlet fancied with the, quote, sequins of pseudoscience, end quote, namely Zombart's own screed. In an important sense, Pollock polemicized against Zombart primarily in his capacity as a prominent proponent of the far right, and his polemic also targeted self-avowed fascists such as the Austrian economist Ottmar Spahn. Certain elements of Pollock's critique of Zombart, the demolition of reactionary anti-capitalism, the leadership cult, and the concept of an organic community, already prefigured the analysis of fascism later developed by the Institute. His acute observations led him to appreciate that the rise of National Socialism posed a very real danger. He still hoped that the introduction of a democratically controlled form of planned economy might avert a fascist dictatorship, but the political situation looked increasingly dire. The first couple of years under Horkheimer's directorship of the Institute allowed Pollock to bring his quest for political independence and a social role to a satisfactory conclusion. As he distanced himself from his family and his business, from the Jewish community and from party communism, the refuge of his friendship with Horkheimer had long since become utterly indispensable. He had managed to create a small world of his own in which he played a clearly defined role. In his relationship with Horkheimer, he was tasked with making ends meet and guaranteeing the constant renewal of their covenant. In the Institute, he was the administrative director and Marx-inspired economic prognostication. To society at large, he was a recognized scholar and the Éminence Grise of the controversial but nevertheless widely respected Institute of Social Research. Pollock was able to identify fully with each of these roles, and they put him at ease with himself. Contemporaneous observers described Pollock as a self-assured and equable character who always had his finger on the pulse of current developments. Few knew quite how protracted and arduous the process of self-reflection had been to which he owed these qualities. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 6. It's not chapter 6, chapter 5, Christ. Chapter 6, the next chapter in this book, is titled Dusk. Thank you for listening.